Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to yet another episode. As always, I have a very exciting guest, and today is definitely no different. I have Shannon Boschy. He's a dad from Ottawa, and he shares a very similar passion as I do, which is gender ideology in the schools. Shannon is a writer for Woke Watch Canada. He speaks at the school boards as well, and he also uses AI to do research and development into how the trans ideology is perpetuated online and the effects of it. Shannon, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, David. I'm glad to be here.
I've seen that you are very outspoken at online and at schools on this topic, and I just wanted to briefly understand, how did you get into it? When did you kind of realize the importance of it? And just share some details.
Yeah, well, I think like a lot of people who have been brought into this, I was affected directly. And it really came to a moment of catalysis or a WTF moment about 2 years ago, where I fit a profile of a particular family, a left-leaning. I thought I was progressive, broadly inclusive in society, and my daughter started making noises and saying things when she was probably 11 or 12. She was asking questions about, I wonder if I'm bisexual or lesbian, and my belief around that is that I love my kid regardless, and I wanted them to, whoever they were and whoever they grew up to love in life, that was something that I believed in, and then the language started to change. Words I'd never heard before: pansexual and demisexual, and it wasn't a forefront conversation. I thought, okay, well, we've got a child who's going through puberty, and they're curious, and I'll just let them explore. And I think a lot of parents do that. And then just after she turned 14, it was the day after Easter Monday. So we're that was 6 years ago, 5, anyhow. She came to me, and she was raised in two homes, 50% with her mom, 50% with me. She said, I can't live with you anymore. It's unsafe for me here, and I can't be who I really am. And there was some language that I didn't really understand. And so she decided at that point that she was going to live with her mom full time. And it was kind of shocking because none of the language that she was using made sense to me. She has a biological brother and two step siblings, and they had grown up together for 10 years, and we had a loving home and a family dinner every night, and weekends at the cottage. And we've really, really focused hard on spending time with our kids and raising them in a wholesome environment and supporting them. And it was shocking. I didn't understand it. And for a long time, I thought that the issue was because of a high conflict divorce that she was in the middle of, and that there was some alienation that was happening. And there was, in fact, alienation, I know, after the fact, but it wasn't so much her mom. It was the school. This was shortly after the schools had, and look, I can't, for legal reasons, it seems to fit a pattern that it was the school, but because the schools keep secrets from parents, I don't know. Mm-hmm. And because I'm treated as a hostile other, or a hostile, unsafe party, I was really cut out of this school situation. It became apparent after she alienated herself, or after she moved in full time with her mom. She was very angry, and we didn't speak for, I don't know, 9 months. It took a long time to rebuild that kind of relationship, which I worked hard at. And it was, I lost my role as a dad when that happened. And now, well, the real kind of shift for me happened because I didn't understand what was happening then, when my daughter came to me right after she graduated high school 2 years ago and said, I'm starting cross-sex hormones. And I asked some questions. Again, loving dad. I want to understand what's happening. She changed her pronouns after moving in with her mom, and did the online thing, and started experimenting with different names. And again, I thought that was just kind of a phase, maybe. That's something that she would naturally go through. I'd studied gender dysphoria and transsexualism in abnormal psychology in university. I took a couple courses there, and I actually almost completed my bachelor's in psychology, but I decided to do my major in another subject and didn't declare a minor or didn't go on and do another degree. So I've got some language around this, and she didn't fit any patterns that I understood. And then after she said she was taking cross-sex hormones, and I said, well, I want to understand your decision. You're an adult now. It would just exploded. I was called hateful and bigoted, and now the narrative is that she was abused her whole life, which is completely false. But this cult of gender alienates children from their families, and any disagreement is considered not just rejection but hate. And I couldn't ask any questions at all. So I've been alienated completely from my kid for 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine a parent going through something like that. Sending your kid off to school, expecting to get an education, coming back with all these questions. And the more I've been paying attention and the more I've been getting involved in the school, like you said, they have policies where they keep this stuff away from parents. I can't really think of any situation that this kind of behavior is appropriate. Now, I know our school board, the director said, these kids are at risk of elevated depression and suicide. And to me, when I hear that is, well, shouldn't you be telling the parents? If these kids are at risk and if they're going through all of this stuff, the parents need to be part of the conversation. But even the language and the policies, the way they frame it is they keep the kids away from the parents because there might be harm over there. So they treat the parents as hostile and not understanding. And I think they foster this mindset at school of victimhood, that everybody is out to get them. And one of the things I guess that you said is this stuff started at school. And I find that the schools are heavily involved in the social transition part, and they work with other organizations. I would say these organizations pose as like therapy organizations, counseling organizations, and they cross into medical stuff as well. And these organizations are also invited to speak in the school, to raise awareness, to chat with the kids as well. And I think there's a transition happening, a social transition fostered by the school. And then these kids are introduced to these organizations who come in. Now, I've seen kids come out of the school with pride flag tattoos on their face and goodie bags with the organization. This particular one is called Okay to Be Me. They come in, they do talks at schools, and I think this leads the kids into the next step from the social transition. They have handouts on how they could start their medical and physical transition. What have you found the school role was particularly in regards to your kid and how they handled the situation?
Well, a lot of this was new, so I feel like I'm a parent who went through this years ago before major awareness started. In my research, I found that these policies really came in around 2014, and my relationship with the school kind of ended when my child alienated themselves from me, and and then I started doing research. So my research began with just trying to understand what's happening, and I read Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, and Deborah So's book, The End of Gender, and Helen Joyce Tran's Ideology Meeting Reality, or Meets Reality, and just consumed myself with trying to understand what was happening. And then I started looking at school policy about a year ago when Carolyn Brzezinski from Waterloo District was speaking at her school board and was silenced and canceled and defamed. A few months before that, I'd met Billboard Chris, and we were mobbed by about 300 activists that were motivated by all levels of government, well, school board, municipal, and provincial. The MLA, MPP for where I am, one of the city councilors who ended up running for mayor, and school board activists and their rhetoric online mobilized this mob against us. So I was kind of shocked from a position of confusion and trying to grasp what was happening to like, holy crap, this just isn't an online phenomena. It seems to be this safetyism that has moved out of universities, and these activists they're violent. They vandalized Chris Elston's car and pushed him around and poured liquids on him and Chanel Fall that day. It was the three of us. My school investigation really began in January of last year with Carolyn Brzezinski's speech, and then I started writing. I wrote for on my own Substack and got quite a bit of traction, and then more research and more writing, and I traveled across the country last year talking to teachers and university professors and parents and people concerned about this in all different areas, healthcare and even first responders, the firefighters and paramedics out in British Columbia who are seeing this on the ground and having to cope with changing languages and the whole gender. It's a cult, right? That language is starting to come out in areas like the National Post and in public media. It's becoming easier to say this is a cult. When people push back on that, I sometimes say, well, look at the word cult and look at the word culture. Cult comes from culture. It's the root of culture. Not all cults become culture, but this one is attempting to become culture and impose itself. And it's on the edge of being a violent and destructive cult at this point, with the number of assaults and near riots that we've seen, really aggressive, violent behavior by trans activists. So the school thing it's a big part of it. My concern is that the kids are getting indoctrinated, and that's where I'm putting the majority of my energy is in, pushing back at the school level to protect children. But there's lots of other areas that this affects.
Now, there was a recent delegation that was done at the Ottawa School Board. You did it, and there was another dad, Nick Morbido, where he was talking about basically the effects of this ideology and how it allows men to go into the women's change room and women's bathrooms and playing women's sports and whatnot. Now, as a father of two daughters, this is very concerning to me because I don't want men to go into these spaces and expose themselves, and I don't want my daughters competing against men, especially in like rough sports. I don't think they have any boundaries. I think pretty much any sport goes. You just imagine you send your daughter to school to play a sport and gets run over by some guy, because boys and girls are completely different, and I think it's fine for boys to have their outlet amongst the boys and the girls to have their own place as well. But there has been quite the activism going out there during this delegation. Now I've seen some videos online about it. As you were there in person, what did you observe?
Well, first of all, a local activist and a group that he founded called Horizon Ottawa, the guy's name is Sam Hirsch, was pumping out hysterical claims of genocide and saving trans kids and protecting trans children from bigotry and hate and all these things. And he was whipping up a mob. And I arrived an hour before the meeting, and there were already a lineup of, the estimate number was about 300 people. The idea was that the activists were going to pack the room and not let anybody else in. And they were already chanting, and they were belligerent, and of course a lot of them didn't get in. And I tried to get, as a delegate, I have a seat reserved for me, so I was trying to walk up to the doors, and people were blocking me deliberately, not letting me pass, and trying to surround me. And I just kept walking. And I was saying to people, like, you get out of my way or I'm coming through you. And one person put their arm out, kind of like tried to clothesline me across my chest. And I was about 8 or 10 people from the door. And I said, look, I'm a delegate. I'm speaking. I'm going to enter the building now. And then everyone started saying, I'm a delegate. I'm a delegate. And they were trying to basically confuse the person at the door to try and get access. And the person who blocked me, I walked through them, and then they started screaming, don't touch me, don't touch me, like insinuating that I was assaulting them. And they pressed their arm against me, and I grabbed their shoulder and I pushed them out of the way. Technically, they're assaulting me, right? When somebody it touches you in an unwanted way, that's assault. Anyway, I wasn't going to be intimidated by that crowd. I'd been in crowds like that before when we were with Chanel and Chris Elston and I were mobbed. And I got to the door and I got in. But I already knew that this was dangerous. I've been reading about crowd psychology and mob behavior the last 4 or 5 months, a number of different books. True Believers is one that's being quoted a fair bit right now, written by a guy named Eric Hofer in the early 50s. And he was writing about the mob psychology of Germany and Europe and the really nasty mass psychosis, basically. And you can see it. You're not dealing with an individual, you're dealing with a mob. And the mob has a collective identity and a collective consciousness or pathology. They all behave the same way. They chant the same things. So we finished our delegations. The room inside was packed with activists, except for Nick, a couple of his friends, and his family, and myself. And we spoke first, and then the school board and the activists packed the rest of the docket with hysterical claims. And you talked about the suicide thing earlier. These are lies. They're lies to manipulate people emotionally. Emotional blackmail is a fair description of how these people work to impose their outcomes. They don't care about anybody else. They claim to be talking about human rights. They only care about themselves and getting what they want. And this, especially the trans movement, is driven by, that in itself is predatory. When a person insists that I'm going to get what I want and I don't care about outcomes for you, I'm just going to take it. I'm going to impose myself into your bathroom. I'm going to parade around naked and you don't get to object. That's predatory behavior right there. It's flat, full stop. It's failing to acknowledge the human need and the emotions and experiences of other people. But these people demand that their lived experience be respected. So when we finished the delegations and the whole delegation process wrapped up, and Nick and I kind of looked at each other, and we're going to leave now. And Josh Alexander was there. I came out into the foyer, and it was great to see him. For viewers who might not know Josh, I don't know if you've talked to him yet. He was the young man who was expelled from his Catholic high school for saying God created man and woman, and biology is real. There's only two sexes, and he was, told he was unsafe for people around him. Anyway, so I'd met Josh before and chatted briefly in the foyer, and there was some media, and I started heading for the door, and someone said to me, "You don't want to go out that way. We'll take you out the side door." So I went out the side door, and I texted a friend who was waiting for me, and came around the corner of the building, and you could see the mass. It was just kind of seething, and they were chanting "Save Trans Kids" and all these mantras. Nick spoke very well and very calmly about bathroom safety, and it's a bigger issue than the trans issue, than self-identification. There's a lot of issues with bathrooms there in schools in Ontario, Toronto. Like, there's pornography being filmed. There's violence in bathrooms. People are attempting to take pictures of other people. There's drug dealing and vaping, and the police have been removed from the schools, and teachers have been warned not to go into the bathrooms. So how do we protect all children here? So Nick spoke to this, and said rightly that self-identification is a problem, and then I spoke about freedom of expression. There was nothing hateful or bigoted or transphobic in anything we said, but just to say that we have a right to express our concerns. And Nick, he shared an interesting solutions proposal for everybody that would include everyone. But the mass outside had been led to believe that we were hateful and harmful and bigoted, and they're willing to act on that. So I didn't go near the crowd afterwards. There was still, I'm going to guess, there was 80 to 100 people still outside, an hour after I went in. And when I came out, and they're just, seething and bouncing and pulsing. And you could feel it's like, going near them would be dangerous. And then Josh came out. He must have gone 90 seconds after I did. And he went out the main door. And I don't know if it was because the escort took me to the side door at the time, and no one intervened to stop him from going out that way, or he decided, no, I'm going to go out and I'm going to walk through the crowd. But as we all saw from the videos, someone threw coffee over him, and he was jostled a bit coming out. Again, that's an assault. It's an unwanted attack and provocation. And then there was Josh he's a minor. He's 17 years old, right? So here we've got a seething mass, a mob that's assaulting a minor. I saw a video of another child who had been pushed down and was assaulted, and adults were pulling and getting him away from the crowd. A senior citizen, one of our elders, right, was knocked to the ground by this crowd, and a woman by a vice principal of a school. These are obvious aggressive tactics by this mob. And that's kind of what we're dealing with at this point. Just yesterday, a major piece came out by, I think his name is Michael Schellenberger. He's a doctor. He wrote in the National Post about beware of this claim of genocide, because it's leading activists to behave in very aggressive and destructive ways. And we can anticipate, we've seen lots of violence already. I wrote a couple of weeks ago on Woke Watch Canada in my weekly report that I predict that the coming months are going to see a lot of increased violence around the world, stuff that we haven't seen in our lifetimes. I'm deeply concerned about it, especially because police are standing back. They're saying, well, if you're bigoted and transphobic, we saw this with Chris Elston recently, where one of the police officers was laughing at him and saying, well, no, you consented to the assault. So in a consensual fight, you can't charge anybody. And that was their claim. But he was standing with his elbows tucked in, with his camera, and he was being surrounded and mobbed by this aggressive group. So I'm really concerned. This is the same kind of psychology that actually leads to genocide.
Yeah, 100%. I saw those videos. I thought it was pretty crazy. And I think anytime you attach terminology such as life-saving And genocide, you imply that the people who don't participate are the ones incurring the deaths, incurring the genocides. And I think this is leading to a bigger problem. Speaking about the police, I do have concerns because the police don't seem to be doing their job in this situation, and they allow things. Now, I think the police is pretty captured as well. I've actually went to my local police station. I tried to call them on the non-emergency number. I tried all the extensions that they had over there, like patch me through to anybody. And then my thing was, once I get through, then I can talk to somebody and just be forwarded to the appropriate person. I did not get an answer on the phone from the police. Nobody picked up on any extension that I called. So that was a problem. So then I went down to the police station and I talked to the officer over there. And I said, look, I have concerns about what's going on at the school board. They have these books, pornographic books available to minors. You know, these books are pretty descriptive. And my role as a dad, when I find that there's a sex scene in a book, is to bring up my concerns, and the school board needs to deal with it. It's not like the school board doesn't have other books to put in, right? And he said to me, essentially, that the school board, first of all, there's nothing they're going to do, and that the school board is trying to foster people to accept themselves and to accept other people, and just kind of this like lovey-dovey, let's all hold hands, we're all different. And I said to him, that's great, but I have 2 daughters, and boys are allowed to go into the girls' change rooms as well. Like, this ideology, I understand that you have this idea of what is supposed to happen, but these people, like the kids at school, they're not dealing with this. Like, this is, if a boy was to go into my daughter's washroom or change room when she was there, and my daughter was to kick them out, who would get in trouble? Well, my daughter would get in trouble because she's the one that's got a phobia or whatever, right? So it became clear to me that the police isn't doing anything. And I asked the officer there, I said, I need a document, a procedure. I need something that you have that basically gives information on identifying and reporting child sexual grooming. What is it? How do you identify it? How do you report it? Etc. He said he doesn't have anything, right? And I said to him, you know, we had the conversation, and I said, I'm not leaving until I get something. Like, you need to give me something. And then he went in and he talked to some other person, and they gave me these pamphlets about online child victimization. And I looked at these pamphlets, and I came home and I looked at it. And basically what's happening in schools and in real life is what they claim to be happening online. You know, like how to identify this. But they're not doing anything about the real life stuff, you know, and it was very disappointing. Like, this stuff, from what I've seen, starts right from the top, right from the government, and the government accepts this. I mean, we saw the Trudeau, he announced on Women's Day that trans men are women as well. So when the leader of the country is basically pushing this ideology, I mean, everybody else just falls in line. And we have a Conservative Party here in Ontario, for the Ontario province, and the Ministry of Education, I can't get a hold of them. And it doesn't seem like anybody cares. So having said that, what do you think is a catalyst for change, a solution? What is something that you recommend to parents?
Well, first of all, figure out what's going on in the schools. And what we have to do is start documenting the process. So let's use the analogy of an abusive and bullying work environment. If someone is being harassed at work, whether it's, through intimidation or manipulation or sexually harassed, the first thing you have to do is start documenting it. Same thing with spousal abuse. You have to get a paper trail, and you have to follow some steps. And the first step is to, keep a journal. And if there's, digital evidence, emails, try and get things in writing from these administrators who are rejecting inquiries. The reason that I spoke about free speech at the school board meeting and freedom of expression was to put the school board on notice that you don't get to do this. You're claiming human rights, but you're violating the number one human right that we have, and that's to criticize the government and to be able to speak to power. You don't get to use a quasi-constitutional organization that protects people in limited categories in housing, services, employment, and to censor people's speech arbitrarily, using that as a weapon. Those, again, are lies. They're intimidation tactics and they're manipulations. And everyone in the school system is trained this way. And not all teachers act this way, but all the training that they're getting right now is all rainbow flags and anti-racism, and they are taught this is human rights, so you don't have to respond to concerns. Human rights is your shield. And their shield is a lie. But most people don't know that it's a lie. So understanding what our rights are and documenting those violations of rights is the first step. There's a sort of a chain of process to go through with the schools. And I think you've done this, is to talk to the teachers and to ask for exemptions from these things, and to talk to the principal and talk to the superintendent, and then talk to your trustee and document the concerns. We have to wake parents up to this. That's the second thing, because a lot of people don't know. And fortunately for us, and unfortunately, the activists are demonstrating exactly who they are. And it's becoming very obvious that these are aggressive bullies who claim to be anti-bully. They are discriminating against women and violating the boundaries of children and claiming that they're being inclusive. And they're aggressive and predatory in lots of cases, and they don't care about other people's experiences. So the documentation is what we have to do. This is not a short process. Now, the things that I've read about in terms of mass psychology and it's kind of social movements is that we are at the end of a long cycle, and there's a bunch of different ways of looking at this, but a long cycle in society. I work in the finance world. I'm wealth management and financial planner. And there's a very well-known wealth management guy named Ray Dalio. And he's written a book recently called The Changing World Order. And he talks about that every 80 to 100 years, the gap between the rich and the poor gets really big. And then you get a grievance culture, or the people he calls the redistribution people, communists, and the like. And every 80 to 100 years, this cycle repeats itself. So communism, maybe the name was new 150 years ago, but the concept wasn't. And we're seeing that resurgence. Another way of looking at this is something called a saeculum. And a saeculum is a length of, it's a 4-generation cycle. It's about 85 years. And we start with a very conservative post-crisis mindset. After World War II in Germany and Europe was a crisis. And the post-crisis is, how do we put our society back together? And in North America and in Europe, we returned to very strong family culture and values. We came back to religious tradition, and then each generation kind of, well, the word is degenerates. Mm-hmm. So the hippie revolution was a degeneration from the post-war very conservative mentality. And then the Generation X's were pushing back against some of the, excess controls and issues that the problems occur at every level. And then we had the millennials, and now we have the Gen Zs, and each is a degeneration. So we get farther and farther from conservative and protecting, and now we're at, let's call it peak degeneracy. And this creates a crisis in society. And the crisis can be very, very serious. It can be genocidal. It can be global war or total war. But it can also be cultural or psychic or spiritual crisis. It doesn't have to be you know, involving millions of deaths. And at the very least, we're in a spiritual crisis right now. We're fragmented as a society. We don't have a common mythos is the word. We don't have a common set of values and principles that we all agree to and share. And that creates fragmentation and isolation and allows these things to fester. Unfortunately, I believe the crisis is going to get worse. It has to get worse. And one of the things that we can do right now is really start to formulate a revisioning of our spiritual identities, our collective common humanity, and start to talk about that with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is pretty insightful. I never really thought of it that way, but I do know before change happens, before the collapse of anything, things get really crazy. And that's exactly what I'm seeing right now. Now, one of the things that is the unknown is how far will it go before something snaps, right? I mean, I think the situation right now with kids being given medication and their genitals being altered and all of this behavior being called as empowering, I think once you involve kids, people are starting to wake up a little bit. Do you think that the pendulum has started to inch back, or do you think, it's still flying off the rails right now? What are your thoughts in regards to that?
Well, I think we can look to England and the UK, and I don't know what it is about the joke or the label is Turf Island. TERF, for viewers who don't know, stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. But especially the women of the UK have pushed back on this, and the politics has started to follow. So the Tavistock Clinic, which was the second pediatric gender clinic in the world and the largest pediatric gender clinic in the world that was doing these puberty blockers and referring for surgeries and pushing this trans ideology, has been condemned as unsafe for children and closed. And England is revamping their models for dealing with gender dysphoria, which is the discomfort in one's body that's being fostered. And I think there's a whole lot of psychological reasons for that and technological reasons for that we don't have time for today. But we see it in the UK, and then we see Norway, Finland, Sweden. We're starting to see major publications. A year and a half ago, there was just nothing in major media. And a few weeks after Chris and Chanel and I were mobbed, the Washington Post came out with an article written by Laura Edwards Leeper, who's a psychologist from California who dealt with gender dysphoria in kids for a long time, and Marcy Bowers, who is a trans woman, a biological man, and a doctor who'd worked for WPATH, that's the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, both critical of shoddy care and a lack of following even the grossly negligent low standards of WPATH, and how few clinicians were following it and the impact on kids. So that was a bit of a watershed moment. And then there was a trickle early last year. The CAST review, which led to the closure of the Tavistock Clinic in the UK, was published in March of last year, I believe, February, March. And we've seen a cascade in Europe. So we're starting to see media now cover in North America. The National Post changed their editorial standard last year in August, and they're being more and more truthful about what's happening. This week they called it a cult in the headline. Canada is very far behind. Perhaps Canada and Australia and the state of California are the three worst jurisdictions in the world for this. And I think we can look to those other countries leading on this as benchmarks, of where we're going, and as indicators. in the financial world, we call them leading indicators. So we see a change in one area of the economy that might have an impact 2 years later. Well, we're seeing changes in policy, changes in media, changes in governance, and a conversation in Europe, and I think that's a leading indicator of what we're going to see here. I believe very strongly, and I spoke with somebody from the America First Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., who's working on this file, and they're helping with changing state legislation, formulating state legislation all across the U.S., especially in red states, that we're seeing all kinds of news of. They're working at the policy level. But they and others that I've talked to who are they're in think tanks and kind of leading conservative Republican groups in the U.S. believe strongly that this is going to be, it might be the leading issue of the 2024 election. And I heard Americans in policy talking about this a year ago already. So, it's going to become bigger and bigger. We can count on the activists becoming more hysterical. That's why I think, as what this is pathological narcissism at scale. So I unfortunately have experience with narcissism. I was raised by an abusive narcissist father, and narcissists have a certain way of behaving. They escalate their behavior when they're called to account. They don't like boundaries. And they push a false reality that they gaslight onto the world. They impose their model of the world into reality and force other people to work within that. People call it a reality distortion field or a reality bubble, and that's what the trans activists have done. Not at an individual level, but at a large level, and they're attempting. We can think of this as like almost one form. In Eastern metaphysics, the translation is thought form. Carl Jung, the psychologist, called it a collective consciousness, or an archetype, or an archetypal possession. The word archetype comes from arche and typos. Arche is the same language we get from archangel. We're talking about things that we have understood as humans in generations past. This is not an angel. This is an evil possession. And I don't consider myself a religious person. But that's it. We're reaching a point where that's the only sufficient language to describe what's happening.
I listened to a narcissism professor. His name is Professor Vatkin, Sam Vatkin on YouTube. Yeah. And he talks about this hall of mirrors. And the way I view it is everything that a narcissist does needs to be reflected back at them, right? Like and I see this in society. Anywhere you turn, it's the same thing, right? Like the language that you use is harmful. The things that you do are genocide. If you don't fall in place, right? Like it must fit that narrative. It must reflect back the reality that is imposed, or I'm going to say the illusion that is imposed.
Yep.
Now, you've also mentioned that you've done some work with AI. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I feel like there's something ordained about this because it kind of fell into my lap. After Billboard Chris Elston, and I and Chanel were mobbed, I was at a cocktail event here in Ottawa, and I've made my profession through networking and building business relationships. And my wife is a professional business development person. We're connected. I mean, we can pull a thread and connect to just about any business leader in Ottawa quite easily. And at the cocktail party was someone I've known for quite some time, who's the head of an artificial intelligence research firm. Maybe the better language is machine learning. So we have they use an awful lot of computer horsepower to analyze opinions and consumer decision making and behavior online. And they've done research on suicide indicators online, and they've worked with a number of different research organizations. They can publish peer review, so we can have academics publish the results that we're working on. Anyhow, the CEO said to me, well, would you like me to see, I can do a quick ping and see what the response was online to this event in Canada. And she came back a couple of days later and said, well, look, the conversation has spiked. We estimate there's 75,000 conversations happening on Twitter about this in Canada. The sentiment is largely against childhood medical transition. 65-70% of people say no. And then we started a conversation about, well, how could we use this tool to understand the social contagion theory and see if there's indicators that we can get. Now, the machine learning that we have, or the AI, I've called Miley. Miley is the name of the Norse god of travelers, or the patron of travelers. And in the Christian context, we can think of Miley as analogous to Saint Christopher. There's an explorer function here. Mm-hmm. And Miley goes, I draw the distinction, we have tourists. I just got back from Mexico, a resort, and we have travelers. A tourist goes somewhere to see what they want to see, but a traveler goes to see what's there. So we've deployed Miley the Traveler into online spaces. Right now it's Reddit and Twitter. We've got very large population samples, and we can regress back to 2012 to see what and look at trends. So we've identified the conversation. We've identified our sample populations. U.S. Twitter is almost 300,000 users. We've regressed the conversation back to when it really started to explode in 2014, 2015 to now. We've figured out the public sentiment. We've figured out who some of the major influencers are in the trans spaces, who the personalities are. Now we can think about that. During the height of the pandemic, and a lot of people have very divergent views on vaccines. But during the height of the pandemic and the beginning of the vaccine mandates, there was a handful of people, less than 10 in the U.S., that were the source of all the most fanciful conspiracy theories about vaccines, that they're nanotechnology, that they're mind control and 5G and all these things. That there was really only 10 or so people that were pushing this out. Unhelpful. We've been able to identify those people in the trans cult who are operating online. We know who they are, and we know the tactics that they're using. We have data that's coming. It's actually due on the 15th. I'm traveling next week, and we're meeting with the AI company the week following, where we've identified trans users. One of the big problems with the machine learning is its original training was to identify male users and female users. And just like us, the AI was very confused when we start saying trans-identified man. Well, trans-identified man is a born man who decides to live like a woman, right? And there's all kinds of terminology that's very confusing. So we had to teach Miley how to recognize these different users, and so we have confirmation now that Miley can distinguish trans men and trans women and their patterns of behavior and conversation online. And we're going to be able to regress that conversation. We're going to be able to identify patterns of behavior and patterns of kind of beliefs. One of the things that I found, and in order to train Miley, I had to do work online to identify hundreds of verifiable trans users. So I had to scroll, 1,000 profiles to say this is a trans user, and be able to identify by pictures and by the pronouns and by, them self-identifying. And then we took those, we ended up with about 250 users, 125 or so trans men. These are born women, right? Born girls who then decide that they're going to live as a man or try to, and same thing with trans men. And just from human intelligence, the patterns are quite frightening. It emerges very quickly. People like my daughter, highly creative, My daughter was an early, precocious reader, very, very intelligent. My daughter challenged me at chess at 6 years old. I'm not a great chess player, but she could put me in a pickle in grade one. And early reader, very interested in drawing. There's the anime culture and the fandoms. It started with Harry Potter fandoms and then moved into others. So a lot of creative, a lot of drawing, a lot of animation, a lot of manga, cartoons and anime and Japanese fantasy narratives. And a lot of these people are pursuing art themselves. My daughter now is in art school. It's a cult, right? It's a culture, and it's political. The correlation between trans-identified people and social justice is extraordinary, right? Gays and lesbians in our society fit in all range of political spectrums. I know plenty of conservative gay people and lesbians. So they're evenly distributed, and your politics are independent from who you love. But in the trans world, that's not the case. It's political. So we start to build cases for legal. We start to build a foundation for advocacy to change laws and policies to inform policymakers, politicians, and police about what's happening. Our next phase is to be able to identify persuasion patterns, coercion, manipulation, lies, cult-like tactics, and hopefully be able to document that this is happening, and this is one of the reasons behind the just incredible explosion in numbers of trans-identified kids. So it's a humbling process here, because I've never done something like this before. I've raised close to $40,000 since last August. I have more to raise, and hopefully this new data set will help me push to the next level. It's all private funding, small nonprofits who are supporting us. $100 a month kind of contributions from families who are concerned to help us keep the wheels going. It's cost us about, the way we have it structured right now, it's about $4,000 a month. But our next move is to go into Tumblr, and Tumblr is the place where people say this is the origin of the trans cult. And to start into Tumblr, now that we've trained Miley to identify trans users, is going to cost us about $20,000 to get all the coding and set up the process. And that's going to add to our monthly data and maintenance costs. So I suspect it's going to be $8,000 or $10,000 a month in maintenance costs once we can build this out. And then we want to write about it and communicate about it. And the people working with us or advising us, Dr. Lisa Littman, who coined the term rapid onset gender dysphoria with her published paper in 2018. Dr. Lisa Marciano. Lisa is a Jungian analyst and therapist, and she wrote about social contagion theory in 2015, 2016. She started seeing these patterns. And we've got a number of other really high-profile, credentialed academic researchers, cognitive scientists, therapists. We've got machine learning people. There's tons of inputs into this, so that we can create really credible results and persuasive results. And it may not be for a couple of years before people really catch on to the importance of the work that we're doing. But people are already questioning, like, how did this happen and how did we get here? And we want to find the answers in digital space.
If anybody wants to support, where can they do it?
Thank you for asking. The nonprofit is called APISC Digital Research, Adolescent Peer Influence and Social Contagion. APISC Digital Research is our website. People could reach me by email at apiscdigitalresearch.com, Shannon at APISC Digital Research, or reach out to me through Twitter. I'm an active Twitter user, and because that's, I think, our greatest source of breaking news in this world. And I'm happy to talk to people.
Excellent. I'm going to be linking all of these in the video below so people can get in touch with you. Do you have any publications, or do you plan on putting something out? It sounds very interesting.
Yeah, I launched the APISC Substack last month, and I once we get this data set, I want to be doing regular short articles. I did a long form article that's pinned in my Twitter on what social contagion is. Now, social contagion happens between individuals, but it's a microcosm of the mass psychosis that we're seeing, which is also socially contagious. Cults indoctrinate people through socially contagious mechanisms. But a simple level, fidget spinners are socially contagious, and so is yawning. Right? So humans are susceptible to pick up culture and acquire culture from their environment. Fashion is socially contagious, right? We pick up behaviors and culture. We're learning machines. Machine's not the right word, but as children, we are biologically programmed to acquire the culture around us, and so we have a natural function to mimic and mirror and engage in the cultures that we're surrounded with. And in some cases, we have, like healthy social contagion. Language, at its most fundamental level, is socially contagious. But we have also very unhealthy and destructive social contagions. Eating disorders, cutting, self-harming, suicide has been documented as being socially contagious. So what we're really trying to map is the destructive social contagion of gendered ideology.
Yeah, this is really cutting edge, and I'm really excited to hear and see what's coming on the horizon. Shannon, I just wanted to thank you so much for joining me. Before we end the podcast, I wanted to know, is there anything that you wanted to say that you feel like we have not covered?
I think the one thing that I would add to the question that you had about what can we do, I'm filing police reports. One of them is tied to harassment and defamation. So there are a couple people locally that are defaming me and have defamed myself and Chanel Fall. And they're the same people who are whipping up the mobs. And so I'm filing a defamation suit against this individual to attempt to hold them to account, because I'm a professional. I rely on my reputation for my business, but also to force them to check their language and behavior. And I'm also going to file a police report now, whether the police will do anything or not, but to take that documentary evidence that this person is whipping up a violent mob, costing police and taxpayer resources doing it, through slander and defamation, creating very dangerous situations where they're inciting violence, and to begin a documentary process of that. Now, the police may open a file. Well, they will open a file. Whether they do something is another question. But at least that someone is taking the step to file that. And then the next time they whip up a mob, to say, hey, guys, I told you so. This person is acting in a way that's causing it's breaking down our social bonds and our social contracts. And they're doing it through lies and defamation. I suspect that the intelligence agencies already recognize this kind of thing, but we need to document that stuff. And if you're experiencing that, if viewers are experiencing that, or they're in a crowd or they're online and they see people in their communities who are inciting this kind of, they're the ones inciting hatred, like you said, this hall of mirrors, right? They call everybody else hateful, but their behavior is actually hateful. And so we need to start and document, as I said earlier, and that's another layer of process.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, I've done a podcast with Pierre Barnes, and we went over sexual misconduct cases at school, and you'd be surprised about the kind of cases that were approved by the police, including the teacher putting songs with inappropriate lyrics for kids to listen to, having books that were inappropriate, making jokes and inciting sexual things. So I really encourage parents, if they're seeing this kind of behavior happening to their children, you need to approach the police, because these cases are going to be growing if people gain awareness of what's happening. And these teachers, during these cases, you could view this podcast. I think it's episode 3, if I can recall off the top of my head. But you can have a look at the kind of cases that are being approved, and it seems very encouraging. Well, Shannon, once again, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to share your experiences and your insight into this gender ideology and how it affects the students. All links to Shannon's documents and websites will be posted in the description below. I want to thank all the viewers and listeners if you've made it this far, and I hope you enjoyed. Looking forward to the next one. Take care.
Thanks, David.